I'm setting this down. I'm going back to my tablet. Oh, let me go mute.
Okay, good morning to our postman members Garrett and Vollendroff, staff and guests. The lobbies are open. The recording has begun.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. We'll convene the Liquor and Cannabis Board Caucus meeting for November 1st, 2022. Good morning, everybody. We've got a different and special caucus today. We're going to start the first of what looks to be 3 conversations we're going to have about the 10th anniversary of the passage of Initiative 502, which created the legal adult market for cannabis, of course. And today we'll hear from really the architect of that. I'm joined at the table here in the office with Kathy Hoffman, our policy and rules manager, and of course our agency director, Rick Garza, who will participate as well. And I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Hoffman to get us started.
Great, thank you, Chair Postman. Good morning, board members Garrett and Vollendroff. So on November 6th of 2012, Washington voters enacted Initiative 502, joining Colorado to pioneer the nation's first 2 systems of legally producing, processing, and retailing adult use cannabis. And now 10 years later, we're recognizing this milestone by hosting a series of discussions this month with people who led the creation of the Washington system, chronicled its impact, and are involved in cannabis businesses. So to kick off the series this morning, we'd like to welcome ACLU Director of Political Strategies, Allison Holcomb. And I'm going to take a few extra moments here to introduce Allison and share her background and recognize her experience in drug and social justice policy reform, because it extends far beyond the passage of I-502. So as we know, Allison was the primary author of 502 and directed the political campaign that led to its passage. In 2013 and 14, she traveled to Uruguay to consult with Jose Mujica. I think I said that completely wrong, I apologize. But that successful effort to lead the country to be the first to legalize and regulate cannabis. And she's participated in convenings in Chile, Mexico, Spain, Canada, the Netherlands, New Zealand, London, Warsaw, Athens, Vienna, New York City, and Washington, D.C. to share and compare views on cannabis policy and politics. In 2014, she joined the National ACLU to launch its campaign for smart justice and supervised the development and implementation of the Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform's 2016 ballot initiative campaign that reduced drug possession from a felony to a misdemeanor and directed the state criminal justice system savings to community-based rehabilitation efforts. She returned to the ACLU of Washington in 2017 and co-chaired De-Escalate Washington, the campaign to pass Initiative 940 that reformed the legal standard for criminal liability for police use of deadly force and requiring enhanced training and independent investigations. From 2016 to 2021, she served as chair and vice chair of the International Drug Policy Consortium, and that's a global network of over 180 NGOs in more than 65 countries that promote objective and open debate on drug policy at the national, regional, and international level, and support evidence-based policies that are effective at reducing drug-related harm. Before joining the ACLU in 2006, Allison practiced as a trial attorney for 13 years, representing accused individuals in criminal, civil rights, and civil asset forfeiture proceedings at state and federal court. She received her BA from Stanford University and her JD from the University of Washington School of Law. And I'm sort of questioning my existence right now. Anyway, Allison, thank you so much for joining us today. to begin our conversation, I will turn it over to Chair Postman.
Thank you, Kathy. Good morning, Allison.
Good morning.
There you are. Hi. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Really looking forward to this. I know you don't have any prepared opening remarks, but anything you'd like to say before we get started at all?
Thank you for that very warm introduction, and it's truly an honor to be here. I want to express my sincere and deep gratitude for the fantastic work that the Liquor and Cannabis Board has undertaken over the past decade. LCB was not consulted before this task was thrust upon them by the passage of Initiative 502. And overall, I think the board has done an amazing job at ushering in this country's first legal cannabis industry. So thank you for all of your work.
Great. Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it. I'll just take the opportunity of the microphone to ask the first question, which is this what you imagined it would look like? How does what we're doing today fit what you thought when you started work on that initiative?
When we started working on the initiative, our only goal was to pass a law that would end the criminalization of cannabis growing, selling, and first and foremost, possessing and consuming. The ACLU of Washington has always viewed all drug prohibition policies as grounded in racism. And our goal was to pass a law that first and foremost would withstand the scrutiny of the federal government. We had no idea whether or not the federal government would allow Initiative 502 to actually be implemented. And we're very pleased that it did. Today, when I look at the ongoing evolution of the marketplace, what resonates most deeply for me is how successful we were in crafting an initiative, a measure that would give the board a great deal of flexibility and encourage the board to include community perspectives in how this industry needed to evolve to meet the goals of continuing to roll out an industry under an ongoing federal prohibition, and also to address those racist underpinnings of cannabis prohibition and start to address the inequities that our communities have suffered as a result of prohibition. So while the specifics may look different than anything we could have imagined, the core of what has evolved over the last decade, it seems consistent with the aims when we sat down to begin drafting.
Yeah, great. And as you're just saying, that really the nut there was to remove this criminality which was being abused and disproportionately based on race. And without that piece, I mean, there really would have been no way to advance that cause of decriminalizing or making that more equitable even without legalization, right? Is that where we came to at that point in Washington?
You know, I think that that's partly right. You know, there was obviously an option to pursue simple decriminalization of possession. There was actually quite a bit of debate at the time of whether or not we should be just decriminalizing all activities relating to cannabis. So decriminalizing growing cannabis, decriminalizing rolling joints for your friends and selling it to them or giving it to them. Decriminalizing meaning we would just simply remove the criminal laws that related to cannabis, but not also try to stand up a regulatory system to govern how cannabis could be produced and distributed for commercial purposes. We could have stopped with just possession. That is the overwhelming majority of arrests that are inflicted on individuals across the country still to this day is for possession. There are many fewer, it's roughly 90% of arrests that are cannabis related are for possession, not the production and sale of it. We could have just done that. But we were at this interesting time in history back in 2010, 2011, and 2012, when the federal government had recently stated that it had no interest in going after people who were in compliance with state medical cannabis laws. And pioneering entrepreneurs across the country saw that as a bit of a green light to stand up a very robust industry. Some of us may remember back then the numerous co-ops and clubs that proliferated across communities with neon cannabis leaf signs and started to create some friction with certain neighborhoods who were concerned about what appeared to them to be less of an authentic medical cannabis system, and one that was allowing a great deal of illicit question, is this really a medical transaction that's happening? And so there was this opportunity that was presented to us to introduce the idea that we can actually regulate cannabis. We can regulate its production and sale, and we actually focused that intent on the medical side of cannabis. And there was a bill that was passed in 2011, Senate Bill 5039, I believe, although I'm sure some of the people on the call will correct me on that, but it was a bill that was passed that stood up a regulatory system just for medical cannabis. And it was line item vetoed by the governor at that time, Governor Gregoire, out of concerns that the federal government would come in and potentially arrest and prosecute state employees who were trying to implement this law. And the feeling by many of the people that had worked on that was one of frustration and a perception that there was a lack of understanding that the intent here was to create a responsible regulatory system for a product that was not going away, regardless of whether people were using it for medicinal purposes or for recreational purposes. This is a product that has been in our communities for centuries, and it's not going anywhere. So why don't we think of a more productive way to regulate it and try to address the public health concerns that we have than treating it as though its consumption is a crime and you should be arrested, prosecuted, and saddled with lifelong hurdles to engagement in society. So a window was open for us that we were not expecting, and that is when we decided to pivot from an idea that we would simply try to decriminalize possession and or stand up a regulatory system just for medical uses of cannabis, and actually try to craft the first full legalization and regulation model in the United States.
Yeah, I'll pause, let others jump in here. Jim, Ollie, Rick, if not, I'll keep going. So I'll ask you another one that
I have a quick question.
Okay, go ahead, Jim,
David.
sorry.
Allison, it's great to see you. It's been a while, and I actually have been thinking a lot about our early on conversations back in 2002. And one thing I was always impressed about was the focus on public health and recognizing, okay, yes, this has had a huge impact on racial justice, and that's a really good reason for us to move forward. It's not going anywhere, so how can we regulate this in a positive way? And there was always a recognition that we wanted to keep product out of the hands of young people. And I really appreciate that and have been impressed with the industry since I've become a member of the board with that same philosophy. Everybody that I've talked to agrees on keeping product out of the hands of young people. Early on, there were provisions around investments in prevention, research, and treatment that were written into 502, as I recall. And I'm curious about your thoughts about where we are now versus what was in the original bill, and what thoughts you have about a obligation of making sure that some of the revenue that comes in is used for research, prevention, and treatment. Just some thoughts on that. And again, it's really good to see you.
It's so good to see you too. And I want to thank you for all of the excellent advice that you gave us and how to think about how do you build in the guideposts for how we continue to develop and refine increasingly effective strategies for prevention of especially youth initiation of cannabis use and any intoxicating substance or mood altering substance, anything that's impacting the brain of a growing person. And your input was invaluable into thinking about what needs to be in the initiative and what do we need to create space to mature going forward. We continue to vastly underinvest in prevention. At the time that we were drafting Initiative 502, I think that the best research that we were looking at proved that every dollar spent on prevention was worth $7 spent in incarcerative strategies or even in treatment, because obviously, an ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure it holds true, and especially in this context. And so when we think about prevention, yes, absolutely keeping cannabis out of the hands of youth is critical to us. And also, and perhaps even more so, helping youth make the choice that they're not really interested in initiating cannabis use as young people. And at the time, we were looking at the research that had been done on the success of the truth.com campaign in reducing tobacco initiation by youth. And for us, that became a touchstone. What would it look like if we spent a great deal of money on creating the gold standard strategy for figuring out how to engage youth? What do they actually listen to? What is actually persuasive to them? How do we respect and recognize their intelligence? And when provided solid information, will make choices for themselves that preserve their own health, that protect their own health. And I fear that what we've seen a little bit is that there's a constant battle every year to make sure that more funding isn't funneled off to law enforcement strategies, to strategies to police the marketplace and or other policing outside of the marketplace. We really have at the core of 502 the value that this is about ending what's bad for our communities and shifting us to strategies that are good for our communities, and continuing to focus on punishment and incarceration and penalties has never proven to be good for communities, especially in the context of people's use of intoxicating substances. Investing in the health of those communities in smart ways. We've learned so much about prevention now. I don't need to tell you that just say no didn't work, but we've come a long way, and we need to be investing more money in testing, piloting every new strategy that we can that is focused on how do we protect and promote health, and assessing and evaluating whether or not strategies we've adopted are actually successful. That was one of the, partnering provisions with those investments in new strategies for addressing cannabis was also an investment in third-party evaluations. We put that with Washington State Institute for Public Policy. I think that can be shifted in other places too, but really holding ourselves accountable for the policies that we're testing is important. So we really do need to have third-party independent evaluation of every policy change that we make in this new and evolving industry.
Yeah, super important. Hey, you mentioned young people in your comments, and one of the things that I've really pivoted towards in the last 10 years, so since we've actually talked significantly about any of this, is the involvement of young people in public policy and public policy decisions is an area that I have really focused on in the last 10 years. And I'm wondering if the ACLU involves young people in public policy discussions, and if so, what value do you see in agencies like the Liquor and Cannabis Board in engaging young people in public policy discussions related to cannabis, alcohol, tobacco, and vaping products?
That is such a great question. I love that question. We have engaged with youth in what are traditionally considered youth policy areas, right? So engaging with them around juvenile detention, engaging with them around school discipline and policies in their schools that are marginalizing students, but leading with that idea that here's the bucket of youth issues. We have in our drug policy work engaged with primarily the adults who are working with youth and developing youth. But I love this idea of engaging directly with youth in assessing these policy choices, because they're the ones that we are trying to craft the policy for. And if we're not hearing their perspectives, we're going to continue to fail, or at least stub our toes and not deliver everything that we could.
Great, thank you.
Holly, go ahead.
This going back to the first conversation on prevention, what are you seeing, or are you aware of the difference, if any, with youth between cannabis and liquor, alcohol, on prevention?
Oh, I hesitate to talk about the data on that specifically, only because it's been a minute since I've looked at it. And I also want to acknowledge the confounding factors of COVID and what young people have been grappling with as their schools have been shut down, as they've been dealing with isolation, as they've not had the same access to socially protective environments. When I was looking at the Healthy Youth surveys before COVID hit, what I was noticing was that we were not seeing a spike in cannabis use among 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. There were some increases, I think, in a couple of ages that were roughly within the margin of error over trend lines. And I thought, I could be wrong about this, and I will apologize right now, but my recollection is that youth alcohol use might have been decreasing a bit. I think it's still too early for us to assess whether or not there's any sort of substitution effect among young people and their decision to experiment with or use on a more regular basis intoxicating substances. So I'm just going to stop there. I apologize that I don't have a better handle on the data for you.
Rick's got a question.
Hi, Allison. Good to be with you again. You said you didn't consult with us, but we did consult with you immediately after the initiative passed. Really trying to understand what the intent was. And I think it's a great opportunity to educate folks, because the biggest question that we get from folks are certain aspects of the initiative and why are they different than what the other states have done. There's 4 states that will be voting next week. I think we're up to 21 states adult use. All but 3 states have medical. It's amazing that that's happened in the last 10 years. What's also amazing is we've had no movement from the federal government. But let me just be specific about a couple of things, Allison, because I remember asking you this 9 years ago. You don't allow vertical integration. So that's very unique to what the other states are doing. I think California and New York have pieces of that. But I remember asking you specifically, you used the old liquor model where you didn't want to have financial interest between the producer processor tier, the growers, and the retailers. It's the old alcohol model. And I remember asking specifically because here you had a medical program that was totally vertically integrated, and yet the initiative did not do that, which meant it would take 3 years to merge both. And I'll have a quick question about that, but I want to make sure everyone else gets a chance. But remind us, because other states have always asked that question when they meet with us, and all of them have, why not allow vertical integration? And I can share that's created some struggles for us here, but I remember what you told me those years ago. So please share that with us, because it's a very significant difference to the other states.
Absolutely. Thanks. And so good to see you, Rick. Thank you again for the invitation to meet with you all today. So the thinking behind including the tied house rule in the original draft of I-502 was to take as conservative and protective an approach as possible to minimizing the risk of exploitation of the consumer and incentives to increase excessive use by the consumer. So the tied house rule, as you know, was based on trying to prevent alcohol manufacturers from owning the bars where customers would come in and maybe get a free sandwich along with whatever alcoholic product they purchased. And that the alcohol manufacturers had a direct interest in increasing excessive use of alcohol by their customers. I think that in the context of large businesses, and I think we're seeing increasingly large cannabis businesses across the country, that still makes sense. Obviously, there's a difference in the current cannabis industry in that we don't see on-site consumption in social clubs, for example, or in bars. And so the analogy is imperfect. A second issue, though, and this is especially true here in Washington State, where we have a very relatively limited number of retailer licenses available, is that vertical integration really cuts into our ability to create an economically equitable marketplace. Right now, retailers have lopsided power over who can actually make a living in the cannabis industry. Because there is a limited number of licenses, producers and processors are a bit at the mercy of retailers with respect to what they can charge for their product, because there are only so many retail outlets that these producers and processors can sell to. The cannabis industry right now is really in favor of the investor owner. And what I would love to see is for our marketplace to evolve to have owner operators, more owner operators. And I would say that it's time to evolve the tied house rule, specifically to have the legislature pass the craft license option, so that small businesses where you have a cannabis producer actually delivering their goods through their own outlet. That's a model that would allow for greater economic equity within the marketplace and also avoids the risk of having very large investor owner businesses pushing product and in the valuation of profit over long-term relationships with customers and an actual genuine interest in the product that they are producing.
And you know, Allison, that's exactly what the legislature did in the 70s and 80s to help small breweries, small wineries, gave them distribution rights, gave them retail privileges. And we've talked about that here. We actually sponsored a bill a couple of years ago to give small growers the ability to sell to medical patients, which would be at least a beginning. But I was interested in what you had to say. It's interesting that there was a retailer in Yakima in Vancouver a couple of years ago that shared with us, because we don't allow vertical integration, do we have much more product available? Because when you grow, you process, and you retail, typically that's only your product that you're concerned about selling. And that compared to Oregon and other states, the SKUs in our stores outnumber most of the other states with respect to products. So consumers are happy when they walk into our retail shop that there's a lot to choose from. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.
Allison, I want to go back to the medical piece of this. What was your thought of how they would how the pre-existing medical system would integrate into this new strictly regulated recreational? Was that going to be sort of homogenous? You know, as one, how was it supposed to work?
Right. So I have to start my answer with acknowledgement of my personal bias that came from having been a criminal defense attorney for over a decade and representing a large number of people who were in the cannabis, well, they were in the illicit cannabis industry at the time, and there were also a great number of medical patients who were trying to navigate the rules about what was okay for them to produce at home, where they could go if they were unable through disability or their living circumstances to produce their own cannabis for medicinal purposes. And frankly, witnessing what felt to me like exploitation of patients who were in very vulnerable positions. And there were some, a few, not all, there's some wonderful, wonderful people who were operating cannabis co-ops and doing so very ethically and lovingly, frankly, with respect to both the product that they were making available to patients and to finding a way to get the product to the patients who needed it. But it only takes, you know, a small handful of people who are more interested in taking advantage of a situation in which, you know, the risk of being arrested and prosecuted as a cannabis patient was incredibly stressful and traumatic for a lot of individuals. And there was some abuse, frankly, of I'll say the latitude that was given by some local governments to people operating in these gray margins of the medical cannabis industry. So from my perspective, the most important thing to do was to bring regulation to the cannabis industry. And again, we started with medical and wanting to have the Department of Health create a regulatory system and actually be monitoring for the use of pesticides in producing cannabis, for example, and other growing practices that were dangerous for people that had seriously compromised health. And so that's where we were focused when we expanded from regulating the medical cannabis market to a ballot measure that would create just a straight legal marketplace for all adults. The idea was that, yes, anybody that wanted to run a medical cannabis industry could also get a license in this area. And I think what evolved over time was a recognition that there should be some special regulations and opportunities to get licensed for people that were specifically interested in medical quality products and providing information and greater levels of assistance to patients who were consumers.
And it seems that because the medical was operating in that gray market area, when we started to move to the 502 market, it frankly allowed some in law enforcement to go really heavy on that gray market, it seems to me. Whereas, you know, we didn't have enough protection. So there was an advantage to them prior to 502 because they could operate in that gray area. But then it didn't have any of the protections, obviously, of regulation. There was no license you got from the state for that. And law enforcement went after them really hard in that transitionary period, which I think we're still struggling with a little bit now. And how do we bring that up? And, you know, we've tried both in terms of a equity question and can we get licenses in the hands of some of these people that were operating the collectives, and also continuing to do some of the things that are in law about what we should have available for medical consumers, and trying to make sure there's this DOH compliant material. So I think we have work on that end for sure.
I'd like to circle back and just revisit my answer here, because I was describing two different categories of individuals who I witnessed as being involved in the medical cannabis marketplace at the time. People that, through my own personal interactions, again, these are my personal observations and perspectives, seem to be operating in the spirit of the latitude that was given to medical cannabis. And then a different category of people that was much smaller, but that I viewed as frankly being a bit predatory towards medical patients. There's a third category that's so important that I think is actually at the heart of the concern that you've raised, and that's the category of people that were straight up cannabis producers and sellers, and maybe some of what they were selling was to medical patients, maybe some of it wasn't, but they were not trying to take advantage of medical patients. They were providing this product that's in demand to people who wanted it, and they were taking advantage of what shelter they could from completely irrational, unreasonable, and again, bound in racism, rooted in racist policies. And far be it from any of us to say that those people aren't as deserving of the opportunity to take advantage of the legal marketplace as anybody else. And they make excellent arguments that they, above others, should be prioritized because they've been in this marketplace for so long. They've been living with the stress of cannabis. They know the cannabis business. They have a trusted customer base. Loyalty is a thing in the cannabis industry. And frankly, I think this is the place where the board has a lot of power. When we drafted 502, we drafted it so that all criminal penalties and all civil penalties are removed from anything that the board says. If you are in compliance with board regulations, if you're validly licensed by the board, you are not subject to criminal and civil penalties. That's the introductory language to every licensing provision for producer, processor, and retailer. It starts with whatever the board says. If it's okay with them, it's not a crime and there's no civil penalty applies. So you have all the latitude in the world. You also get to determine, how many licenses to issue, or whether or not there should be a cap on licenses, frankly. And so I would encourage the board to really examine how far it can press to bring more people in and give more people the opportunity to benefit from the ongoing expansion of the marketplace.
Certainly. Ollie?
Allison, are you aware of our social equity plan now and what we've put together for social equity in order to try to do what you're describing?
Yes, I attended several of the meetings earlier in the year. I haven't attended the most recent ones, but I have a general understanding of the goals and the proposals that have been approved at this point.
So have you seen, now that we've done the CR 103, the program, have you had the opportunity to look at the program that we're actually putting together?
I think I looked at the proposal as it was drafted in narrative form. I have not looked specifically at the 103 document.
Okay. I think it would be great to have, if you can find the opportunity to look at that, and maybe in our next conversations, kind of give us your feedback on that.
Yeah, we'll send it to you, Allison. That'd be great. Jim and then Kathy.
Thank you, David. I can tell we're not going to have enough time to ask all of our questions here. So I do hope, as Ollie just suggested, the next time we speak, implying that we're going to invite you back, I hope at some point. But so you brought up a couple things that were really critical to me that I wanted to touch base on. And that was the relationship between the retailers and the customer. And I've been thinking a lot about bud tenders. And so when I went on my first ride along and visited a site, and I've actually visited a few retailers and talked to bud tenders, and I see a lot of potential between working with bud tenders and the community around literacy and around high THC concentration products and what are the implications of those. And so I was wondering if was that ever, I don't know if the role of bud tenders was ever part of 502, or if that was just, if it's how it's evolved over time, but your thoughts about that would be interesting. And then I want to actually, you said something about the power of the board and where we're most powerful and all that kind of stuff. And then should we consider the number of licenses? I'm just curious. You threw that out there, and I'm just curious about your opinion about the number of licenses we have.
Sure. I'll answer the second question first because it's a short answer, and absolutely. I think it's time for us to expand the number of licenses and really start to think more broadly about how we make a more equitable marketplace. There are issues with landlord dynamics and the power that they wield over these businesses. Some of this would have to be done through legislation, but is there a reason why we shouldn't experiment with state acquisition and development of properties and fair leasing programs that would address the horrible lopsided leasing proposals that are out there from some of these landlords who realize how hard it is to find a location under the law. The bud tender idea is fantastic. As you know, the best way that we make connections with people is face-to-face, eye-to-eye, having conversations, developing relationships over time. And to the extent that we're encouraging businesses to move in the direction of having educated, invested bud tenders who are establishing long-term relationships with customers. And this goes back to, my bias in favor of owner operators over investor owners, people that actually have skin in the game, that actually care about their customers, and not just based on what Yelp reviews say, but are really there to establish relationships. And that is one of the best ways to create a trusted education program, right? At least my perspective, and I'm not a public health expert by any stretch of the imagination, but my understanding is that we get the best results from educational programs that have trusted messengers talking to the audiences that we're trying to reach. And who's more trusted than your non-judgmental bud tender that just wants to make sure you get product that you like and that you have a good experience and that you feel happy and you're well and you can come back and enjoy the next product that they sell to you.
Yeah, thank you.
And we heard that from the public health people who came and talked to us about youth use and things, that there's only so much you can do by regulation or labeling or whatever, and that an educated consumer is important. So, Kathy.
Okay, thank you. Again, Allison, thanks so much for being here. It's been a great conversation so far, and it looks like our conversation is kind of turning prospectively, and I wanted to kind of touch back on something you said about expansion of the market and thinking about expansion of the market, product innovation into the next 10 years. Can you share thoughts, ideas, perspectives on what you think about that?
Sure. I think what's important first is that when we talk about expansion of the marketplace, that what we mean is an increase of the number of people that are involved in this marketplace, that have an opportunity to be involved in this marketplace. We're not talking about expansion of the amount of product that is available and that we're trying to sell in the marketplace. That will happen. The amount of product that we're talking about is going to happen and be driven primarily by demand, although certainly decisions that we make about how we structure the marketplace have an impact on how much weight is given to or how much power is given to industry investors who have an interest in enhancing the amount of problematic use there is. So another, rule of thumb from the public health space is that 20% of your users are using 80% of your product, and we want to keep tabs on that and figure out what are some of the policy choices that we could be making to encourage reasonable use amounts rather than pushing excessive use by a smaller number of people. And I think that is about having more owner operators coming in, having more licenses available that are focused on advantaging small businesses that are establishing trusted relationships with their consumers, where there is more of that personal connection, because intoxicating products are different from other products. It matters who's talking to you about the experience that you're having with respect to intoxicating products. We don't have that as much with alcohol. If you go to a winery, you have a much more of a lingering social conversation with someone about it, and it's about the social experience versus swinging by your liquor store to pick up a fifth and go home and drink alone. And I think we want to, at every opportunity that we have, to increase the number of experiences that people are having with cannabis that are focused more on pro-social interactions, the more success that we'll have in creating a new model for introducing an intoxicating substance into a marketplace. We can learn from the lessons of alcohol. At some point, we'll have to deal with the fact that we've given the industry and its lobbyists too much power over our regulators. And that's something I think we're still at a place in the cannabis industry where we can think seriously about that and map out how it could look differently.
What you were just saying is fascinating to me, the power dynamics that exist. And you know, on the liquor side, it's so well established, right? I mean, you know, they've been out there doing this for a long time, even though in our state we redid the system for alcohol. Well, Costco redid the system for alcohol, and then we added cannabis to the portfolio. But I feel like we're at a point, not a tipping point, but a junction for sure about what that looks like going forward. And we have a lot of conversations with the industry. You know, you hear a lot, we want to be treated like any other business. And, you know, I think that's hard today only because this is a business the federal government, you know, wants to close its eyes to and not really give fair treatment to. And hopefully that'll change. It's also, you know, even alcohol is not treated like any other business. It's treated like a business that sells a product that can be harmful and all that. And I you know, the other thing that we face a lot is this question about, are we picking winners and losers? You know, tier 1 versus tier 3, or, you know, the multiple licensees, the vertical, all those things. And I guess I just, you know, since we have one of the authors here, the prime author, I just like, you know, where would you have us go? And does legalization, particularly with the prospect of national legalization or decriminalization, does it just make it inevitable that we're going to be talking about bigger businesses, fewer businesses, bigger businesses, and that power is going to shift? Or should we protect the original intent of the founders of this system?
Talking to an ACLU lawyer about the founder's intent is always dangerous, especially at this particular time in our nation's history. So let's.
But at least we have a founder who we can talk to and see, and after a life. But yes, point taken.
Let me say this first. We should not treat cannabis like the cannabis industry or cannabis like any other product or any other business. That would be a failure. You know, when I talk about drug policy, I frequently talk about the greatest flaw, one of the greatest flaws of the war on drugs being the notion that all drugs are the same and treating them all the same and having the same strategy for dealing with the fact that they're in our society. Cannabis is not tomatoes, it's not milk, it's not coffee, and it's okay. One of the things that we need to get used to in this country is talking about intoxicating substances as if they're not all life-devastating vices, but they are, each of them has its own profile. There is a reason that people use cannabis or wine or any other intoxicating substance, cigarettes, you know, to an extent, not the same kind of intoxication, but we need to get comfortable with the idea that human beings do engage in activities to alter their mood, to deal with stressors, to increase their social confidence, etc. And there are risks that are associated with not having accurate, adequate information about the choices that you're making when you decide to have a martini or to smoke a bowl or, you know, we can talk about other drugs as well, because we know that they're in our society as well. The second thing I want to say is, not only do we not want to treat it like any other product and any other business, we also don't want to treat it like alcohol, because we have, you know, as we've already said, we've failed to kind of create the culture that we would like to see around the use of alcohol. And we have, you know, we've recovered somewhat from Four Loko, but obviously we have an industry that is focused now on how do we maximize our profit margins. And the way to do that is to get people hooked early and often get them drinking large quantities of alcohol throughout the rest of their life and get brand loyalty, et cetera. So we don't want that. Intoxication, first and foremost, is something we would like for it to enhance people's experience of life. And we would also like for it to enhance social connection, to the extent that we're going to acknowledge that intoxication is in part a desire to feel social connection to others, when it, in its best sense, when we celebrate the arrival of a child with champagne or a wedding, or, you know, it's seen as an enhancement to social connection. And I think that should be a guiding principle in how we want to develop the cannabis industry. That's why I love the idea of the craft license. That's why I love the idea of more people connecting with each other to talk about the products that are being offered, what they do, what's in them, what the risks are. And what else can I tell you about this to make sure that you and I have a trusted relationship around your experience with this product, that you'll come back, and that we'll have healthy communities rather than be pushing at least some segment of our cannabis using population into a place where they start to get in trouble with it. And we start to see the harms that prohibition, I was going to say that prohibition was originally adopted to try to deal with, but I don't think prohibition was of cannabis was anything other than a racist strategy. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that prohibition was designed to try to prevent those public health consequences. We can craft a cannabis industry, I think, that does a better job than either prohibition or the alcohol model.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Yeah, on the sort of social acceptance part, when you talk about champagne with a baby or having a martini, I say often, you know, we're not to the point with cannabis in our state where you would see, say, an elected official after a hard day say, I'm going home and smoking a bowl. They could still say, I'm going to go have a double bourbon, and nobody would blink an eye about that. So, and that will change. I think, you know, it needs to, in that sort of acceptance, but it's also part of the reality that we face, regulators face, is there are still people out there that don't like what we're doing, you know, including in our authorizing environment. And that's a struggle sometimes for us. You know, I would just say for me, I don't, you know, is the board meant to be, you know, if the voters have said, we think this should be legal, my view is yes, then let's get people used to it. But we have legislators who still don't like it, and I think would undo it if they had the chance. Do you sense a change? I mean, I think it is a change, but, you know, what's your feeling on that? Are people getting it in Washington State?
I think one of the opportunities, and I hesitate to say that because it's been so horrible for so many families, but one of the opportunities the pandemic has provided us is the opportunity to really reflect on how harmful isolation is to humans. And when I think about the opportunities in cannabis, I'm reminded of one of my favorite cannabis experiences. And some of you will recall that I am not a practiced cannabis user at all. A couple of you may have had the observation to see me cough myself into tears on occasion. I had an amazing experience in Donosio, Spain, when I was there for a conference. They had a social club where you could have food and cannabis and a glass of wine all in the same location. Private members only club. So that kind of addresses the concern about there still being some social antipathy towards observed cannabis use. You could have spaces where people could come together in a social environment and eat a meal, have a glass of wine, and have some cannabis. I found it to be a wonderful social experience. I didn't have very much cannabis or wine, frankly. Enjoyed the food enormously. And it was exactly what I would love for our relationship with this intoxicant to evolve into. I don't want the politician to go home and smoke a bowl by themselves in their living room and watch Netflix. I want them to go and smoke a bowl with their constituents and hear from them about what their constituents need, and to be open to that. I mean, I won't get too woo on you, but yes, having some cannabis opens your mind and allows you to think a little more creatively than the box that we live in most days. So I would encourage us to revisit the idea of social clubs, having some legislation around social clubs that would allow for us to start developing that responsible, accountable, adult-to-adult social experience around cannabis. I think people use less when they're in front of other people. It's really easy to knock yourself out on your sofa, but you don't want to knock yourself out in front of your friends in a public place, even if it is a members-only public place.
Great. Before we wrap, any last questions from anybody else? Board? Kathy? Okay. We've kept you. Oh, Jim, yes. You're muted.
I'm sorry, I was just going to make a comment because one of my questions was going to be about social clubs. And so I'm really glad that you addressed that. It's been an area that I've been interested in having further conversation, and I've had individuals approach me about that. So I'm glad you brought that up. One last thing, I think Rick mentioned there's a couple of states that are going to be voting here in a couple of days around legalization. And at least 2 of those states have provisions for personal use and growth of individual plants. Do you have any thoughts about that as we evolve?
Yes, and I think I've gone on record with the Seattle Times a few years ago. We are well past the time where we need to remove the prohibition on personal home grows. It's been a decade, and this also, contributes to market control, et cetera. Adults ought to be able to grow a personal use amount. I, leave it to the legislature and or the board to determine what that is. I actually am less concerned about how much you're growing as to how much you're selling. Right? I mean, we know how to investigate people for selling cannabis outside of a validly licensed framework. And if we're really concerned about there being large illicit market commercial transactions happening, we know how to deal with that. So let's stop pretending that we can't have adults grow their own at home.
Great. Yeah, you've given us some great ideas. I think change is coming, whether anybody wants it or not. And it like I said, I think we're at a little bit of a juncture, and we need to be really smart about what we do and how we do it, and being inclusive in those conversations. So thanks for getting us started on this part. We're going to have some other panels, including one with some industry folks in a couple of weeks, and it'll be interesting to hear their take on some of these things. And the industry, just like everything else, is not a monolith, and there's a diversity of opinion and vision, I think, for the future. So it's certainly an interesting time. So thanks for your time, and thanks for doing this for Washington State. Yes. It really has been an incredible thing, and it's really special for us to have you here talking to us through what that vision was in your head. It's really special. So thanks, Allison.
Thank you all so much. We created the bare bones of a policy, and you all have run with it, and that's the deepest honor, that you embraced it and you took it to new and wonderful places. And I'm so excited to see where the board takes it in the next 10 years.
Well, great. We're just going to need you back every week to check in. But,
Deal.
Okay. Thank you, Allison. We'll be talking.
Thank you, Allison.
Thanks.
Thank you. you.
Yeah, and I think what Allison just said is true too. They created this bare bones, the voters approved it, and then put it on your desk, Rick, and said, make it work.
Well,
And
it wasn't quite bare, Allison.
And get the federal government to approve it. And, and Rick has told us about, even other state agencies, when, after it was passed, we're going, oh, not us. We don't want it.
Yeah.
So it was not easy.
No.
And, again, hat tip to our governor, who was not one of your supporters of that initiative when it was on the ballot, but then understood what it meant when the voters overwhelmingly approved it and fought the good fight with his friends in DC at the time. Remember, this was the Obama administration, not Trump. And it was a slugfest. And so, it took all of that. And really the people inside this agency who then could take that vision and put all the words to it in an enforceable way. So, there's some missteps. We're always in a corrective sort of mode, I think, and evolving, hopefully. So it's been fascinating. So again, thanks.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
And that's the one and only thing that we had on our agenda today, but we do have time for some board and administrative assistant reports. First, Gretchen, anything to share today? No. Jim or Ollie, anything to share? Closing thoughts on this topic?
I have nothing.
Okay. Kathy?
Ollie,
Ollie, you have something?
look at you.
No, she's saying no.
That's
Okay,
fine.
great. Then we'll end. I thought it was a great conversation. Thanks everybody for jumping in. Next week, we will hear from a researcher and public health expert, and our own public health expert will be here as well for that part of the conversation. There's some really interesting data available now about usage in our state specifically. That I think people are going to really find interesting. And then the following week after that, we are putting together a panel of some really sharp industry people from different corners of the industry. And I'm really hoping that we'll have some free-flowing conversation there, and there'll be a lot of things, that came up today, that'll come up next week that I think will spur some conversations. So I'm really looking forward to it all. So thanks, everybody. And we do have a board meeting tomorrow, so we will be back here at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Right? No?
No.
We don't have a board meeting tomorrow. We're not going to be back here tomorrow. I have a board staff meeting tomorrow, which is different. You're not invited to the board staff meeting. Should have seen the look on Gretchen's face when I said that. Okay.
I was just looking at my calendar real quick.
Yeah.
That's what I didn't do. I think I do that probably every other week. I mess that up. So anyhow, okay. There's one of my to-dos is to look at the calendar before I talk. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Your question, David. That was,
I know.
so difficult.